would you say is the most significant person to have ever lived? Aristotle? Caesar Augustus? How about Winston Churchill or George Washington? Or Genghis Khan or Mahatma Gandhi? Or how about Chairman Mao? Of all the influences that have shaped our world as we know it, even most skeptics agree that it was a simple carpenter from the nearby town of Nazareth who was the most influential person to have ever lived. I'm Dave Stotts, and in this series of Drive-Through History, we're going to explore the extraordinary life in the order that it took place and in the places that it was lived. This is the story of Jesus of Nazareth, also known as the Child of Bethlehem and the Man from Galilee. This is Drive-Through History, the Gospels. Jesus of Nazareth was a man born in the Middle East and lived 30-something years and had a short 3-ish year career as a teacher, traveling with a group of 12 working-class guys, never venturing much more than 200 miles from his birthplace. He was eventually abandoned by all his friends and was executed for violating the religious laws of his own people. So why, more than 2,000 years later, does almost 1/3 of the entire population of planet Earth identify with the religious faith centered on the teachings of this man? What did he say? And where did these things take place? What is the evidence for these events? Now, the tricky thing about history is that nearly all of it's in the past. But history leaves us a trail of evidence, evidence that points to the truth. Its secrets are simply waiting to be discovered. All you've got to do is go look. But before we steer into the historical world of the first century context of Jesus' life, I'd like you to meet a new friend. I'd like to introduce you to my sweet ride in Israel. This is a 1976 Land Rover. It's 4-wheel drive, and it sports an aluminum body for durability and to keep the weight down. Now let's check under the bonnet. Now this Land Rover sports a 2.5-liter turbocharged diesel. Now this was its second engine. The first engine was a 2.5-liter petrol engine. And I like saying the word petrol in an English accent. Petrol, petrol, petrol. Cheerio. You know, this Land Rover even has a nickname, Steve McQueen, and its owner speaks of it lovingly as you might speak of a faithful family dog. And I am very privileged to be trusted with the keys. And I will do my best to honor that trust. Good boy. Attaboy. Back in the first century, people were often referred to by the town in which they resided or grew up. Jesus was not an uncommon name, so putting of Nazareth next to it was a way of making it clear which Jesus was being spoken of. Today we have last names. Otherwise, I'd be Dave of Quaker City, Ohio, which doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. To set the stage for our series, I wanted to start in present-day Nazareth, the largest city in the North District of Israel, with a population of over 80,000 people.
One of my favorite places to visit is the Nazareth village, where they have built an exquisitely recreated first-century synagogue. Jesus himself would have frequently darkened the doorway of a synagogue just like this as he grew up.
The Gospels are 4 historical documents, and they comprise the first 4 books of the New Testament Bible. And they describe the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And they were written by 4 of his followers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, the word gospel comes from the Greek word euangelion, which means good news. And it's also the source for our modern English word evangelism, which refers to the telling of good news.
The first 3 books, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are commonly referred to as the Synoptic Gospels. The term synoptic comes from the Greek word syn, which means together, and optic, which means seen. The Synoptic Gospels include a lot of the same stories, appearing in a similar chronological order, told from the slightly different perspective of each author. The dating of the Synoptic Gospels is a long debated subject, but a reasonable range looks like this. Matthew was written first according to the early church fathers. That is why Matthew is placed first in the New Testament canon and was most likely written somewhere around the 40s. There is compelling evidence for a very early date of around 41 AD, which is only a few years after Jesus' death. Mark may have been written next, using as a source the witness of the Apostle Peter. And Luke was written probably between 60 or 62 AD and the final trial and eventual execution of Paul in 67 AD. There is a very interesting theory that Luke and the book of Acts were written together as part of a defense for Paul in the trial for his life. And the Gospel of John is often placed last, prior to 70 AD and the destruction of Jerusalem. In contrast to the Synoptic Gospels, John was written from a very unique perspective. One theory for this is that since John was probably written after Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the author may have been aware of those documents and simply not wanted to write a lot of overlapping material. Or maybe John had a different reason altogether. One way the distinction between the Synoptic Gospels and John's Gospel has been described is this. Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written using descriptive language, while John's language was more reflective in nature. John seems to want his readers to understand the events of Jesus' life as he now did, looking back on it all.
As we explore the life of Jesus, we'll be using these 4 books as our primary guide. No other ancient documents have been as thoroughly scrutinized. No other ancient documents are as well attested or have existing manuscripts dating so close to their original composition. There are literally hundreds of ancient Greek manuscripts, compositions, and quotations of the Gospels from the first few centuries after they were written. And we'll be bringing in other ancient documents as well to see what they can contribute to the story. So where exactly, then, do you start when you're exploring the story of the most significant person who ever lived? Let's go with the beginning, along with some stuff before the beginning.
When we open up a Bible to the New Testament, the first book we come to is Matthew. Here's how the writer begins the story. This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar, Perez the father of Hezron, Uzziah the father of Jotham, Jotham the father of Ahaz, Ahaz the father of Hezekiah, Zerubbabel the father of Abihud, Abihud the father of Eliakim, Eleazar the father of Mathan, Mathan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary. And Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah.
A list of Jesus' ancestry may not mean much to you, but Matthew was writing to a Hebrew audience. Matthew wanted his words to carry the weight, the gravitas that they deserved. Matthew knew that he was making a case to a very skeptical, a knowledgeable, and a tough crowd that Jesus held the right credentials. He also knew that his Hebrew audience would want to know the ancestry of Jesus so that they would see if he was qualified to make the claims that he did based on the writings of their holy texts. Genealogical records were very important to Jews in the first century because lineage was key to a person's role and inclusion in Jewish society. Who could be a priest? Who could have political authority? Who could marry whom? These were all determined by your lineage. Today we keep our family records in the local county building, but back in the first century, Jewish family records were likely kept somewhere in the temple complex. Your ancestry determined if you could be a priest. For that to happen, you were supposed to have descended from the tribe of Levi. Now, if you were ever to become the high priest, you were supposed to have descended actually from Aaron himself. Aaron, the first high priest, and the brother of Moses. So the gospel writer Matthew was attempting to establish the royal heritage of Jesus, an unbroken ancestry back to David, the king of Israel, from some 10 centuries earlier.
So for Matthew to give a compelling account of the life of Jesus to a Hebrew reader, it was incredibly important to put that out there right from the start. That's why Jesus' ancestry is there, and that is why it was worthy of attention. This list is pregnant with meaning as it speaks to the history of the Jewish people. The ancestry of Jesus is a study unto itself, and it points to the amazing preservation in the line of the Jewish people that led to his birth.
At this point, you need some more background to understand a little more about the history of the Israelite religious beliefs and the history of the Jewish culture into which Jesus arrived. So, if you don't mind, allow me to set the table.
The first verse of Genesis in the Hebrew Scriptures states very simply, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Genesis goes on to say that God also created mankind. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. And have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth." Genesis 1, 27 through 28. Man is given the special designation in Scripture as being the only thing that is made in God's own image. According to the Hebrew Scriptures, shortly after man was created, he was given a choice, and he chose to reject God's will in favor of his own. Now the serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God actually say, 'You shall not eat of any tree in the garden'?" And the woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, 'You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die.' But the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not surely die.'" Genesis 3, 1 through 4. Now, most of us know the rest of the story of Adam and Eve, and how God cast them out of the Garden of Eden. As a result of Adam and Eve's rebellious choice, that is to disobey and sin against God, the unity between God and man, which had been quite literally perfect up to that point, was now broken. It was here in the book of Genesis that the Israelites got their very first hint of a man who would come to be known as Messiah. In this mysterious passage, God is speaking to the serpent known as Satan, who had tempted them. He said, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." Genesis 3:15. This man would literally crush or grind or strike the head of the serpent, just as the serpent would crush, grind, or strike his heel. The man who would crush the head of the serpent became known in Hebrew Scriptures as Mashiach, or Messiah, which means anointed or chosen one. This man would be a descendant of King David who would restore the unity between God and his people. But this promise had gone unfulfilled for a very long time.
No fuel gauge, no speedometer, no rear view mirror, no seatbelt, no air conditioning, no problem. This is a beast of a car. I think it was manufactured back in 1976, so this car is only about 9 years younger than me. What I do like about it is it's got visibility. Lots and lots of visibility.
During the time of the Gospels, the Israelites had lived on and off, mostly on, as subjects under foreign rule for about 1,000 years, having been conquered by the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and now the Romans. For the Israelites, restoring their relationship with God also had come to be connected with something else, deliverance from foreign oppressors, so that they would be free to live as God had promised them.
The birth of Jesus took place during a time when the Roman Empire extended all the way to Israel. Remnants of Roman structures can be seen all over Jerusalem today. Now, the Romans, with their vast armies of slave labor, built great things and left their mark everywhere that they went. Now, the Roman province of Judea, along with Galilee, was actually a very small part of the empire, about 8,000 square miles, and it was on the eastern edge of Rome's vast territory. Scholars estimate that there were about 1 million or so people living in the region when the Romans took over.
With the appointment of Julius Caesar as supreme ruler, the Roman Empire had its beginnings just 40 years or so before Jesus was born. But the empire officially began when Caesar Augustus received his title from the Roman Senate on June 16, 27 BC.
This period of time began what was known as the Pox Romana. A Pox Romana is Latin for the peace of Rome. It was a time of relative peace and quiet, for Rome, that is, because the Roman Empire was so large and so powerful that they effectively and violently crushed any viable opposition. Now, the Jews, who had conquered this land thousands of years before, were now paying taxes in tribute to Rome for Rome's roads, aqueducts, theaters, government buildings, public plazas, and military garrisons.
When the Gospels were written, Israel was a territory of and under the control by force of the Roman Empire. During the time of Jesus, the Roman Empire stretched from Spain in the west to Belgium in the north, to Egypt in the south, and to Syria in the east, with an estimated population of over 70 million people. The Roman Empire accounted for 1/4 of the total world population at the time. The Romans had brought their own religion with them. It included many gods. After the time of Caesar Augustus, even the emperors of Rome were considered gods. The forceful military subjection by Rome and the Roman introduction of their pagan religion into Israel was a great offense that could not be reconciled from the Jewish point of view with a one country, two systems political approach.
The Roman occupation was yet another in a long line of unholy insults to the identity of a people who believed that they were called by God to be separate and apart. The Jews secretly hoped that someday a savior, a Messiah, would rise up and lead an overthrow of Rome. But in the meantime, they lived under the thumb of Rome, as well as a local leader, Herod the Great. Under the established system of Roman governance, Herod the Great was king of the Judean region, but he was a local power broker, a client king. Now, this meant that he had regional power, but he was still under the authority of Rome. Now, Herod's family acquired power in the region, beginning with the takeover of Jerusalem by the Roman general Pompey in 63 BC. Herod was ambitious and power-hungry, and he eventually gained the support of Rome. And by 40 BC, he was the reigning king of the Jews.
Although Herod enjoyed the support of the Romans, including Caesar Augustus, the Jewish people never really accepted him, since he was raised by an Idumean father, that is, a man from Idumea, and a Nabatean mother. The Roman historian Josephus described Herod as a half-Jew, and since ancestry determined destiny under Jewish law, Herod did not have the ancestral right to be a Jewish king, and pretty much everyone knew it. Herod understood what the Jews thought about him, and he never really felt secure in his position. So he built multiple protective fortresses around the region in case of a rebellion, and he continually suspected that treason and insurrection was afoot. Herod was considered a genius by many, but it was genius of the evil variety. He was a great builder, and he understood how to acquire and wield power. But he also demonstrated a history of paranoia, opportunism, and violence throughout his life. He had a high propensity to murder the people that he did not like, and was always looking for ways to increase his power. In 37 BC, he appointed his brother-in-law, Aristobulus III, as high priest in Jerusalem to eliminate a powerful rival. Herod cast aside his first wife Doris in favor of Mariamne, who was of important Jewish descent, in order to strengthen his claim to the throne. Then later, Herod had Mariamne, her mother Alexandra, and his brother-in-law Costobar executed. He even had his own sons, Alexander, Aristobulus, and Antipater, executed for treason. In all, Herod executed at least 7 members of his own family, and perhaps over 100 of his political rivals, all in order to protect his own position.
Now, what is apparent today when traveling in Israel is that King Herod was indeed a prolific builder. Remains of his colossal building projects can be seen all over the country. Now, King Herod built the Jewish temple, or the Second Temple, or Herod's Temple, in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount. Now, this was no small project, taking nearly half a century to complete. Now, this massive retaining wall behind me, known as the Western Wall, is the largest remnant of King Herod's temple complex.
Images of Jews praying at the Western Wall are some of the most iconic imagery captured in Jerusalem. But what exactly is going on there? The Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall, located here at the foot of the western side of the Temple Mount, is what remains of the ancient wall that surrounded the Jewish temple's courtyard. Many consider it the most sacred site by the Jewish faith, outside the Temple Mount itself. It has been a site for Jewish prayer and pilgrimage for centuries. The earliest source mentioning Jewish attachment to the site dates back to the 4th century, just a few centuries after the Jewish temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. That's why the Wailing Wall became known as a place of weeping. It was and is a site to mourn and bemoan the destruction of the temple. Many pilgrims place tiny prayers written on paper inside the cracks of the wall. More than 1 million notes are placed here each year. And today, some organizations even provide the opportunity to email notes to be placed into the wall.
Now, Herod's handiwork becomes even more impressive upon closer inspection. I mean, look at this one piece of stone right here. Now, these stones here at the base of the Temple Mount are massive. In fact, not far from here, one of these stones weighs over 1 million pounds. That's million with an M and an I and an L-L-I-O-N. It's pretty heavy.
Besides his work on the temple, Herod also constructed a palace in Jerusalem, which later became the Praetorium of Pontius Pilate. Additional construction projects included the famous harbor of Caesarea, the Herodium, Masada, and other fortresses, stadiums, theaters, and temples. Of course, pagan temples and stadiums were not appreciated by observant Jews. These were permanent reminders of their status as subjects in their own land.
Toward the end of the reign of King Herod the Great, the Jewish people were desperate for a leader who would bring them spiritual renewal and the political freedom that they craved. It was into this world that Jesus arrived. And in the next episode of Drive Through History, we will begin to tell the story of the most influential person who ever lived.
We've barely scratched the surface in terms of exploring the riches contained in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But it is critical to understand the context, the world into which Jesus arrived in those sacred pages. As I explored Israel in my Holy Land rover, I was brimming with excitement, knowing that our next step in the journey was to explore the events surrounding the birth of the most important and influential man to have ever lived. I couldn't wait to discover more.